In 1375, Spain as we know it today did not exist. The Kingdom of Castile dominated the central plateau, while the Crown of Aragon controlled the eastern Mediterranean coastline. The Kingdom of Navarre held the northern Pyrenean region, and the Emirate of Granada remained the last Muslim stronghold in the south. Portugal had already established itself as an independent kingdom, setting the stage for centuries of Iberian rivalry and cooperation. The late 14th century marked a period of internal consolidation and external expansion for these Christian kingdoms. Meanwhile, the Crown of Aragon pursued its Mediterranean ambitions, establishing trade networks and political influence across the Western Mediterranean, from Sicily to Sardinia. The 100 Years' War between England and France created opportunities for Iberian intervention in European affairs. These external engagements provided valuable experience in international warfare and diplomacy, skills that would prove essential in the coming centuries of global expansion. Religious tensions permeated Iberian society during this period. The large Jewish communities that had flourished under earlier medieval rulers faced increasing persecution and forced conversions. These conversos, or new Christians, would become a defining feature of Spanish society, creating complex questions of identity, loyalty, and religious orthodoxy that would persist for centuries. The marriage of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon in 1469 fundamentally altered the trajectory of Iberian history. Their reign, lasting until Isabella's death in 1504 and Ferdinand's in 1516, established the foundations of Spanish power that would dominate the following centuries. The Catholic Monarchs' first major achievement was the completion of the Reconquista with the conquest of Granada in 1492. This victory was more than military. It represented the triumph of Christian civilization over Islam and established Spain as the defender of Catholic orthodoxy in Europe. The subsequent Spanish conquest of vast American territories would transform Spain into the world's first global empire and flood Europe with unprecedented quantities of silver and gold. The Inquisition became a powerful tool of royal centralization, extending monarchical authority into the most intimate aspects of subjects' lives while generating substantial revenue through confiscations. The expulsion of Jews in 1492 and Muslims in subsequent decades reflected the Catholic monarch's vision of a religiously homogeneous Spain. These deportations eliminated vibrant commercial and intellectual communities, but they also removed potential sources of internal dissent and satisfied the religious zealotry that characterized their reign. The accession of Charles I in 1516, who became Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1519, elevated Spain to unprecedented heights of power and influence. As ruler of Spain, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, Austria, and vast American territories, Charles commanded resources that dwarfed those of any contemporary monarch. His reign marked the beginning of Spain's Golden Age, when Spanish culture, language, and power spread across the globe. These conquests brought enormous wealth to Spain through the encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous labor and tribute. Philip's territories stretched from the Philippines, named in his honor, to Peru, creating the first empire on which the sun never set. The victory at Lepanto in 1571 against the Ottoman fleet established Spanish naval supremacy in the Mediterranean and positioned Spain as the leader of Catholic Europe against Islamic expansion. The cultural achievements of this period paralleled Spain's political dominance. The Spanish Golden Age produced literary giants like Miguel de Cervantes, whose Don Quixote became the world's first modern novel, and Lope de Vega, who revolutionized European theater. Painters such as El Greco and Diego Velázquez created masterworks that influenced European art for centuries. Spanish became a global language spoken from Madrid to Manila, from Mexico City to Buenos Aires. However, the financial costs of maintaining such a vast empire gradually undermined Spanish strength. Constant warfare in the Low Countries, Italy, and against Ottoman forces strained royal finances despite American silver. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic and reduced Spanish influence in Central Europe. The revolts of Catalonia and Portugal in 1640 demonstrated internal weaknesses, with Portugal successfully regaining its independence in 1668 after nearly 60 years of Spanish rule. And its global dominance had passed to France and emerging maritime powers like England and the Netherlands. However, Spain retained vast American territories and remained a significant European power, setting the stage for the conflicts that would define the 18th century. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, determined Spain's future trajectory when Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV of France, secured the Spanish throne despite a devastating European war, but forced Spain to cede its remaining European territories, including the Spanish Netherlands and Italian possessions, to Austria and other powers. This settlement established the Bourbon dynasty in Spain and reoriented Spanish policy toward domestic reform and American colonial administration. The early Bourbon monarchs, particularly Philip V and his successors Ferdinand VI and Charles III, embraced Enlightenment ideals and implemented significant reforms. Charles III, ruling from 1759 to 1788, represented the epitome of enlightened despotism in Spain. His reign saw extensive urban planning projects, including the beautification of Madrid, the establishment of royal factories, and attempts to modernize Spanish agriculture and industry. Colonial reforms under the Bourbons transformed Spanish America's administrative and economic structures. The introduction of intendants, professional administrators modeled on French precedents, aimed to increase efficiency and reduce corruption in colonial government. However, these reforms also generated tensions that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Spanish Empire. The French Revolution's outbreak in 1789 profoundly impacted Spain, initially leading to war against revolutionary France, but eventually forcing Spain into alliance with Napoleon. The abdication of Charles IV and Ferdinand VII, followed by Napoleon's installation of his brother Joseph as king, sparked popular resistance across Spain. Guerrilla warfare, a term coined during this conflict, proved effective against French conventional forces, but created cycles of reprisal and counter-reprisal that traumatized Spanish society. The siege of cities like Zaragoza and Girona became symbols of Spanish resistance, while collaboration with French authorities created lasting divisions among Spaniards. The Cortes of Cádiz, meeting from 1810 to 1814, produced Spain's first liberal constitution in 1812. Ferdinand VII's restoration in 1814 initiated a period of absolutist reaction that rejected liberal reforms and persecuted constitutional supporters. This repression, combined with the devastating effects of the Peninsular War, weakened royal authority and created conditions for the independence of Spanish America. Between 1810 and 1825, virtually all of Spain's American colonies achieved independence, reducing Spain from a global empire to a European power, with only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines remaining under Spanish rule. Spain's attempts to regain control through military expeditions failed completely, demonstrating the monarchy's weakness and the irreversible nature of American independence. Liberal revolutions in 1820 and 1836 established constitutional monarchies that lasted briefly before conservative reactions restored absolutist rule. The reign of Isabel II, 1833-1868, saw significant economic and social changes despite political instability. The Revolution of 1868, known as La Gloriosa, overthrew Isabel II and initiated Spain's first attempt at democratic government. The Bourbon Restoration of 1874, which brought Alfonso XIII to the throne, established a political system designed to provide stability after decades of revolutionary upheaval. This Turno Pacifico aimed to prevent military interventions and revolutionary outbreaks by accommodating different political tendencies within established institutions. The Restoration system achieved remarkable political stability compared to previous decades, but it rested on electoral manipulation and the exclusion of popular classes from meaningful political participation. Industrial growth in Catalonia and the Basque Country created a substantial working class, while agricultural modernization in some regions increased productivity and commercialization. The construction of a national railroad network and improvements in education and literacy created conditions for the emergence of mass political movements. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in the Spanish-American War of 1898 profoundly shocked Spanish society and intellectuals. The disaster of 1898 exposed the weakness of Spanish institutions and the gap between imperial pretensions and national realities. Regional nationalism emerged as a powerful force during this period, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country. Catalan nationalism combined cultural revival with demands for political autonomy, while Basque nationalism emphasized racial distinctiveness and traditional privileges. These movements challenged the centralized Spanish state and offered alternative visions of national identity that competed with Spanish patriotism. The labor movement developed rapidly in industrial regions, with both anarchist and socialist organizations gaining substantial followings. The Spanish Regional Federation of the First International, founded in 1870, promoted anarchist ideas that found particular resonance among Catalan textile workers and Andalusian agricultural laborers. The Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, PSOE, founded in 1879, offered a more moderate alternative that gradually gained influence in industrial centers like Madrid and Bilbao. The crisis of 1917, triggered by military unrest, Catalanist demands for autonomy, and a general strike, demonstrated the fragility of the restoration system. Although the government survived this challenge, the system never recovered its earlier stability. The Rif War in Morocco, 1909 to 1927, further weakened the monarchy through military disasters and revealed the incompetence of Spanish political and military leadership. The dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, 1923 to 1930, initially supported by King Alfonso XIII as a solution to political crisis, attempted to modernize Spain through authoritarian means. The regime promoted public works projects, suppressed regional nationalism and labor organizations, and sought to create a corporate state modeled on Mussolini's Italy. However, the dictatorship failed to solve Spain's fundamental problems and collapsed during the Great Depression, discrediting the monarchy in the process. The proclamation of the Second Spanish Republic on April 14, 1931, represented the triumph of republican and democratic forces that had opposed the monarchy for decades. The new regime faced enormous challenges: economic depression, regional nationalism, social revolution, and the opposition of powerful conservative interests, including the Catholic Church, army officers, and large landowners. The Republican government attempted ambitious reforms that addressed Spain's most pressing problems, but also generated fierce opposition. Land reform aimed to redistribute large estates to landless peasants, particularly in Andalusia and Extremadura, while education reform sought to reduce Catholic Church influence and create a modern secular school system. Regional autonomy statutes for Catalonia and the Basque Country attempted to accommodate nationalist demands within a federal framework. The tension between reform and revolution characterized Republican politics from its inception. Moderate Republicans sought to modernize Spain through democratic means, while socialists and anarchists demanded more radical changes in property relations and social structures. Conservative opponents, organized in the CEDA, Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Rights, used legal means to obstruct reforms, while secretly supporting more extreme right-wing groups. The October Revolution of 1934 in Asturias demonstrated the polarization of Spanish society and the breakdown of democratic consensus. Leftist workers, convinced that the CDA's entry into government represented a fascist threat, launched an armed uprising that was suppressed with extreme brutality by forces commanded by General Franco. This conflict created martyrs for both left and right, while delegitimizing democratic institutions among extremist groups. The Popular Front's electoral victory in February 1936 brought together Republicans, socialists, communists, and anarchists in a coalition committed to resuming interrupted reforms. However, this victory also convinced conservative opponents that legal means could not prevent revolution, leading to increased support for military conspiracy. Street violence between left and right-wing paramilitaries created an atmosphere of civil war before the military uprising actually began. General Franco's military rebellion on July 17-18, 1936, initiated a civil war that lasted nearly 3 years and devastated Spanish society. The conflict quickly acquired international dimensions as Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supported the nationalist rebels, while the Soviet Union provided aid to the Republic. The Spanish Civil War became a rehearsal for World War II and a symbol of the struggle between fascism and democracy. The war's brutality surpassed all previous Spanish conflicts, with systematic massacres, bombing of civilian targets, and the destruction of entire communities. The nationalist zone implemented a policy of terror designed to eliminate political opposition, while Republican territory experienced revolutionary violence against religious and conservative elements. International brigades brought foreign volunteers to fight for the Republic, while German and Italian volunteers provided crucial military support to Franco's forces. The new regime represented the triumph of conservative Spain over the forces of modernization. Franco's dictatorship established one of Europe's most durable authoritarian regimes, surviving World War II, the Cold War, and massive social and economic changes known as the Years of Hunger Society. 1939-1953 saw brutal repression of Republican supporters and the implementation of an autarkic economic system modeled on fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Concentration camps held hundreds of thousands of Republican prisoners, while executions continued well into the 1940s. The regime promoted a vision of imperial Spain that emphasized Catholic unity, centralized authority, and opposition to liberal democracy and socialism. Spain's neutrality during World War II, despite Franco's sympathy for the Axis powers, proved crucial for the regime's survival. Franco's refusal to enter the war alongside Hitler, based on calculations of Spanish weakness and excessive German demands, allowed Spain to avoid the devastation that befell other European countries. This neutrality also positioned Spain as a potential ally for the Western powers during the emerging Cold War. The international isolation that followed World War II gradually gave way to acceptance as the Cold War intensified. The United States, seeking allies against Soviet expansion, overlooked Franco's fascist origins and signed agreements in 1953 that provided American military aid in exchange for Spanish bases. Spain's admission to the United Nations in 1955 marked the end of diplomatic isolation and the beginning of international legitimacy. Economic modernization from the 1960s onwards transformed Spanish society despite political continuity. The Stabilization Plan of 1959, advised by international economists, abandoned autarky and opened Spain to foreign investment and tourism. Mass migration from rural areas to industrial centers and from Spain to northern Europe created new social dynamics that challenged traditional hierarchies and values. The Spanish miracle of the 1960s saw unprecedented economic growth that made Spain a middle-income European country for the first time in its history. Tourism development along the Mediterranean coast brought foreign currency and cultural influences that gradually undermined the regime's conservative social policies. Women's increased participation in education and employment challenged traditional gender roles, despite official Catholic doctrine. However, economic modernization created contradictions with political authoritarianism that became increasingly difficult to manage. An educated middle class demanded political freedoms commensurate with their economic status, while industrial workers organized strikes and protests despite repression. Regional nationalism re-emerged in Catalonia and the Basque Country, with ETA's terrorist campaign demonstrating the limits of centralized authority. The Catholic Church, initially a pillar of the regime, gradually distanced itself from Franco as Vatican II promoted human rights and social justice. Student movements in the universities, labor unrest in industrial centers, and intellectual opposition created multiple challenges to authoritarian rule. The regime's increasing reliance on repression, exemplified by the execution of ETA members in 1975, demonstrated its inability to adapt to changing social conditions. Franco's death on November 20th, 1975, initiated Spain's transition to democracy, one of the most successful democratic transitions of the 20th century. King Juan Carlos I, designated by Franco as his successor, played a crucial role in dismantling the dictatorship and establishing constitutional monarchy. The transition's success derived from elite consensus, popular mobilization, and international support for Spanish democratization. The appointment of Adolfo Suárez as Prime Minister in July 1976 marked the beginning of political reform from within the Francoist system. Suárez, a young politician with impeccable Francoist credentials, proved capable of negotiating with opposition leaders while maintaining the support of conservative forces. His political reform law, approved by referendum in December 1976, provided the legal framework for dismantling authoritarian institutions. The legalization of political parties in 1977, including the Communist Party, demonstrated the government's commitment to pluralistic democracy. The first democratic election since 1936, held on June 15, 1977, produced a parliament dominated by centrist parties committed to democratic consolidation. Suárez's Union of the Democratic Center, UCD, won a plurality, while the Socialist Party, PSOE, emerged as the main opposition force. The Moncloa Pacts of 1977 established economic and social agreements that controlled inflation while maintaining social peace during the transition period. These agreements, negotiated between government, opposition parties, and trade unions, demonstrated the elite consensus that made democratic transition possible. The pacts also established Spain's commitment to European integration and market economy principles. The Constitution of 1978, approved by referendum with overwhelming support, established a democratic framework that balanced competing demands for centralization and decentralization. The creation of autonomous communities satisfied regional nationalist demands while maintaining Spanish unity, though tensions persisted in the Basque Country, where ETA continued its terrorist campaign. The failed military coup of February 23, 1981, paradoxically strengthened Spanish democracy by demonstrating popular and institutional support for constitutional government. King Juan Carlos's televised address condemning the coup attempt consolidated his democratic legitimacy, while the failure of military plotters discredited authoritarian alternatives. The socialist victory in the 1982 elections brought Felipe González to power with an absolute majority, marking the consolidation of Spanish democracy. González's government implemented significant reforms including abortion law liberalization, educational modernization, and economic restructuring, while maintaining Spain's commitment to NATO membership and European Community accession. Spain's entry into the European Economic Community on January 1, 1986, represented the culmination of the democratic transition and Spain's return to the European mainstream. European integration provided both economic opportunities and political constraints that reinforced democratic institutions while opening Spanish society to European influences. European integration transformed Spain from a peripheral European country into a central member of the European Union, participating in all major European institutions and policies. The benefits of EU membership included structural funds that modernized Spanish infrastructure, agricultural subsidies that supported rural development, and access to European markets that facilitated economic growth. The González governments of the 1980s and early 1990s modernized Spanish society through ambitious reforms that addressed legacies of authoritarianism and economic backwardness. Educational expansion, healthcare reform, and infrastructure development created the foundations of a modern European welfare state. The hosting of the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona and the Universal Exposition in Seville demonstrated Spain's successful integration into the international community. However, the socialist era also witnessed significant problems including high unemployment, corruption scandals, and ongoing terrorist violence by ETA. The GAL, anti-terrorist liberation groups, scandal involving state terrorism against Basque separatists damaged González's reputation and contributed to electoral defeat in 1996. Economic crisis in the early 1990s, following European monetary union requirements, created mass unemployment that persisted throughout the decade. The victory of José María Aznar's Popular Party in 1996 brought conservative government to power but maintained democratic consensus on fundamental issues. Aznar's economic policies emphasized privatization, labor market flexibility, and fiscal consolidation that reduced unemployment and qualified Spain for European Monetary Union membership. The adoption of the euro in 2002 symbolized Spain's complete integration into the European mainstream. The March 11, 2004 terrorist attacks in Madrid, perpetrated by Islamic extremists, shocked Spanish society and influenced electoral outcomes. The Popular Party government's initial attribution of responsibility to ETA, despite evidence of Islamic involvement, contributed to electoral defeat 3 days later. The 2008 financial crisis severely impacted Spain due to a real estate bubble that had driven economic growth for the previous decade. Unemployment reached 26% by 2013, while bank bailouts and austerity measures imposed by European institutions created social hardship and political instability. The crisis discredited established political parties and generated new movements, including the Indignados 15M, that challenged traditional politics. The emergence of new political parties, particularly Podemos on the left and Ciudadanos in the center, ended Spain's two-party system and created coalition politics. The 2015 and 2016 elections produced hung parliaments that required complex negotiations to form governments, reflecting increased political fragmentation and voter dissatisfaction with traditional parties. The Catalan independence crisis that culminated in 2017 represented the most serious challenge to Spanish territorial integrity since the democratic transition. The Catalan government's unilateral declaration of independence, following a disputed referendum, led to direct rule from Madrid and the imprisonment or exile of Catalan leaders. This crisis revealed persistent tensions between Spanish and Catalan nationalism that European integration had not resolved. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 severely tested Spanish institutions and society, with Spain experiencing one of Europe's highest death rates and most severe economic contractions. The government's response, including strict lockdowns and substantial economic support measures, demonstrated both the strength of Spanish democracy and the challenges facing modern European societies. Today, Spain faces numerous challenges, including political polarization, territorial tensions, economic inequality, and climate change, while maintaining its position as a successful European democracy. The country's transformation from dictatorship to democracy, from agricultural backwardness to industrial modernity, and from European periphery to EU core membership, represents one of the most remarkable national transformations of the modern era. Spain's experience demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of democratic modernization in contemporary Europe, offering lessons for other societies undergoing similar transitions while continuing to evolve as a complex, diverse, and dynamic European nation.